There is no need to give further examples. Whatever instance we care to take, we shall always find that the situations in which a logical or mathematical principle might appear to be confuted are accounted for in such a way as to leave the principle unassailed. And this indicates that Mill was wrong in supposing that a situation could arise which would overthrow a mathematical truth. The principles of logic and mathematics are true universally simply because we never allow them to be anything else. And the reason for this is that we cannot abandon them without contradicting ourselves, without sinning against the rules which govern the use of language, and so making our utterances self stultifying. In other words, the truths of logic and mathematics are analytic propositions or tautologies. In saying this, we are making what we held to be an extremely controversial statement, and we must now proceed to make its implications clear. The most familiar definition of an analytic proposition, or judgment, as he called it, is that given by Kant. He said that an analytic judgment was one in which the predicate B belonged to the subject A as something which was covertly contained in the concept of A. He contrasted analytic with synthetic judgments in which the predicate B lay outside the subject A, although it did stand in connection with it. Analytic judgments, he explains, add nothing through the predicate to the concept of the subject, but merely break it up into those constituent concepts that have all along been taught in it, although confusedly. Synthetic judgments, on the other hand, add to the concept of the subject a predicate which has not been in any wise thought in it, and which no analysis could possibly extract from it. Kant gives all bodies, Kant gives, quote, all bodies are extended, as an example of an analytic judgment, on the ground that the required predicate can be extracted from the concept of body, in accordance with the principle of contradiction. As an example of a synthetic judgment, he gives all bodies are heavy. He refers also to 7 plus 5 is equal to 12 as a synthetic judgment, on the ground that the concept of 12 is by no means already thought in merely thinking the union of 7 and 5. And he appears to regard this as tantamount to saying that the judgment does not rest on the principle of contradiction alone. He holds also that through analytic judgments our knowledge is not extended as it is through synthetic judgments. For in analytic judgments, quote, the concept which I already have is merely set forth and made intelligible to me. I think that this is a fair summary of Kant's account of the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions, but I do not think that it succeeds in making the distinction clear. For even if we pass over the difficulties which arise out of the use of the vague term concept and the unwarranted assumption that every judgment, as well as every German or English sentence, can be said to have a subject and a predicate, there remains still a crucial defect. Kant does not give one straightforward criterion for distinguishing between analytic and synthetic propositions. He gives two distinct criteria which are by no means equivalent. Thus, the ground for holding that the proposition 7 plus 5 is equal to 12 is synthetic is, as we have seen, that the subjective intention of 7 plus 5 does not compromise of the subjective intention of 12. Whereas his ground for holding that all bodies are extended is an analytic proposition is that it rests on the principle of contradiction alone. That is, he employs a psychological criterion in the first of his examples and a logical criterion in the second, and takes their equivalence for granted. But in fact, a proposition which is synthetic according to the former criterion may very well be analytic according to the latter, for, as we have already pointed out, it is possible for symbols to be synonymous without having a same intention, without having the same intentional meaning for anyone. And accordingly, from the fact that one can think of the sum of 7 and 5 without necessarily thinking of 12, it by no means follows that the proposition 5 plus 7 plus 5 is equal to 12 can be denied without self-contradiction. From the rest of his argument, it is clear that it is this logical proposition and not any psychological proposition that Kant is really anxious to establish. His use of the psychological criterion leads him to think that he has established it, which he has not. I think that we can preserve the logical import of Kant's distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions while avoiding the confusions which mar his actual account of it if we say that a proposition is analytic when its validity depends solely on the definitions of the symbols it contains, and synthetic when its validity is determined by the facts of experience. Now, thus, the proposition, quote, there are ants which have established a system of slavery, is a synthetic proposition, for we cannot tell whether it is true or false merely by considering the definitions of the symbols which constitute it. We have to resort to actual observation of the behavior of ants. On the other hand, the proposition, either some ants are parasitic or none are, is an analytic proposition, for one need not resort to observation to discover that there either are or are not ants which are parasitic. If one knows what is the function of the words either, or, and not, then one can see that any proposition of the form either P is true or P is not true is valid independently of experience. Accordingly, all such propositions are analytic. It is to be noticed that the proposition either some ants are parasitic or none are provides no information whatsoever about the behavior of ants or indeed about any matter of fact. This applies to all analytic propositions. They none of them provide any information about any matter of fact. In other words, they are entirely devoid of factual content. And it is for this reason that no experience can confute them. When we say that analytic propositions are devoid of factual content, and consequently that they say nothing, we are not suggesting that they are senseless in the way that metaphysical utterances are senseless. For, although they give us no information about any empirical situation, they do enlighten us by illustrating the way in which we use certain symbols. Thus, if I say, nothing can be colored in different ways at the same time with respect to the same part of itself, I'm not saying anything about the properties of any actual thing, but I'm not talking nonsense. I'm expressing an analytic proposition which records our determination to call a color expanse which differs in quality from a neighboring color. Yes, I'm not talking nonsense. I'm expressing an analytic proposition which records our determination to call a color expanse which differs in quality from a neighboring color expanse a different part of a given thing. In other words, I'm simply calling attention to the implications of certain linguistic usage. Similarly, in saying that if all Bretons are Frenchmen and all Frenchmen are Europeans, then all Bretons are Europeans, I'm not describing any matter of fact. But I'm showing that in the statement that all Bretons are Frenchmen and all Frenchmen are Europeans, the further statement that all Bretons are Europeans is implicitly contained. I am thereby indicating the convention which governs our usage of the words if and all. We see then that there is a sense in which analytic propositions do give us new knowledge. They call attention to linguistic usages of which we might otherwise not be conscious, and they reveal unsuspected implications in our assertions and beliefs. But we can see also that there is a sense in which they may be said to add nothing to our knowledge, for they tell us only what we may be said to already know. Thus, if I know that the existence of May Queens is a relic of tree worship, and I discover that Mary Queens still exist in England, I can employ the tautology if P implies Q and P is true, Q is true, to show that there still exists a relic of tree worship in England. But in saying that there are still May Queens in England and that the existence of May Queens is a relic of tree worship, I have already asserted the existence in England of a relic of tree worship. The use of the tautology does indeed enable me to make this concealed assertion explicit, but it does not provide me with any new knowledge, in the sense in which empirical evidence that the election of May Queens had been forbidden by law would provide me with new knowledge. If one had to set forth all the information one possessed with regard to matters of fact, one would not write down any analytic propositions, but one would make use of analytic propositions in compiling one's encyclopedia, and would thus come to include propositions which one would otherwise have overlooked. And besides enabling one to make one's list of information complete, the formulation of analytic propositions would enable one to make sure that the synthetic propositions of which the list was composed formed a self-consistent system. By showing which ways of combining propositions resulting in contradictions, they would prevent one from including incompatible propositions, and so making the list self-stultifying. But insofar as we have actually used the words as all and not, without falling into self-contradiction, might be said already to know what was revealed in the formulation of analytic propositions, illustrating the rules which govern our usage of these logical particles. So that here again, we're justified in saying that analytic propositions do not increase our knowledge. The analytic character of the truths of formal logic was obscured in the traditional logic through its being insufficiently formalized. For in speaking always of judgments instead of propositions, and introducing irrelevant psychological questions, the traditional logic gave the impression of being concerned with some specially intimate way with the workings of thought. What it was actually concerned with was the formal relationship of classes. This is Russell. As is shown above by the fact that all these principles of inference are subsumed by the Boolean class calculus, which is subsumed in its turn in the propositional calculus of Russell and Whitehead. The system, expounded in Principia Mathematica, makes it clear that formal logic is not concerned with the properties of men's minds, much less with the properties of material objects, but simply with the possibility of combining propositions by means of logical particles into analytic propositions, and with studying the formal relationship of these analytic propositions, in virtue of which one is deducible from another. Their procedure is to exhibit the propositions of formal logic as a deductive system based on 5 primitive propositions, sequentially reduced in number to 1. Hereby the distinction between logical truths and principles of inference, which was maintained in the Aristotelian logic, very properly disappears. Every principle of inference is put forward as a logical truth, and every logical truth can serve as a principle of inference. The 3 Aristotelian laws of thought, the law of identity, the law of excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction, are incorporated in the system, but they're not considered more important than the other analytic propositions. They're not reckoned among the premises of the system, and the system of Russell and Whitehead itself is probably only one among many possible logics, each of which is composed of tautologies as interesting to the logician as the arbitrarily selected Aristotelian laws of thought. A point which is not sufficiently brought out by Russell, if indeed it is recognized by him at all, is that every logical proposition is valid in its own right. Its validity does not depend on its being incorporated in a system and deduced from certain propositions which are taken as self-evident. The construction of systems of logic is useful as a means of discovering and certifying analytic propositions, but it is not in principle essential even for this purpose. For it is possible to conceive of a symbolism in which every analytic proposition could be seen to be analytic in virtue of its form alone. The fact that the validity of an analytic proposition in which in no way depends on its being deducible. The fact that the validity of an analytic proposition in no way depends on its being deducible from other analytic propositions is our justification for disregarding the question whether the propositions of mathematics are reducible to propositions of formal logic in the way that Russell posed. For even if it is the case that the definition of a cardinal number as a class of classes, similar to a given class, is circular, and it is not possible to reduce mathematical notions to purely logical notions, it will still remain true that the propositions of mathematics are analytic propositions. They will form a special class of analytic propositions containing special terms. They will be nonetheless analytic for that. For the criterion of an analytic proposition is that its validity should follow simply from the definition of the terms contained in it, and this condition is fulfilled by the propositions of pure mathematics. Ooh, she. The mathematical propositions which one might most pardonably suppose to be synthetic are the propositions of geometry. For it is natural for us to think, as Kant thought, that geometry is the study of the properties of physical space, and consequently that its propositions have factual content. If we believe this, and also recognize the truths of geometry as necessary and certain, we may be inclined to accept Kant's hypothesis that space is the form of intuition of which of ours sorry if we believe this and also recognize that the truth of the geometry and if we believe this and also recognize that the truths of geometry are necessary and certain, then we may be inclined to accept Kant's hypothesis that space is the form of intuition of our outer sense, a form imposed by us on the matter of sensation, as the only possible explanation for our a priori knowledge of these synthetic propositions. But while the view that pure geometry is concerned with physical space was plausible enough in Kant's day, when geometry of Euclid was the only geometry known, the subsequent invention of non-Euclidean geometries has shown it to be mistaken. We see now that the axioms of geometry are simply definitions, and that the theorems of a geometry are simply the logical consequences of these definitions. A geometry is not in itself about physical space. In itself, it cannot be said to be about anything, but we can use a geometry to reason about physical space. That is to say, once we have given the axioms of a physical interpretation, we can proceed to apply the theorems to the objects which satisfy the axioms. Whether a geometry can be applied to the actual physical world or not is an empirical question which falls outside the scope of the geometry itself. There is no sense, therefore, in asking which of the various geometries known to us are false and which ones are true. Insofar as they're all free from contradiction, they're all true. So one can ask is which of them is the most useful on any given occasion, which of them can be applied most easily, and most fruitfully to the actual empirical situation. The proposition which states that a certain application of a geometry is possible is not itself a proposition of that geometry. All that the geometry itself tells us is that if anything can be brought under the definitions, it will also satisfy theorems. It is therefore a purely logical system, and its propositions are purely analytic. It might be objected that the use of diagrams in geometrical treatises shows that geometrical reasoning is not purely abstract and logical, but depends on our intuition of the properties of figures. In fact, however, the use of diagrams is not essential to completely rigorous geometry. Diagrams are introduced as an aid to our reason. They provide us with a particular application of the geometry and so assist us to perceive the more general truth that the axioms of the geometry involve certain consequences. But the fact that most of us need the help of an example to make us aware of those around but the fact that most of us need the help of an example to make us aware of those consequences does not show that the relation between them and the axioms is not purely logical relation. It shows merely that our intellects are unequal to the task of carrying out very abstract processes of reasoning without the assistance of intuition. In other words, it has no bearing on the nature of geometrical propositions, but it's simply an empirical fact about yourself. In other words, it has no bearing on the nature of geometrical propositions, but is simply an empirical fact about ourselves. Moreover, the appeal to intuition, though generally of psychological value, is also a source of danger to the geometer. He is tempted to make assumptions which are accidentally true of the particular figure he is taking as an illustration, but do not follow from his axioms. It has indeed been shown that Euclid himself was guilty of this, and consequently that the presence of the figure is essential to some of his proofs. This shows that his system is not, as he presents it, completely rigorous, although of course it can be made so. It does not show that the presence of a figure is essential to a truly rigorous geometrical proof. Suppose that it did, would be to take as a necessary feature of all geometries, which is really only as an incidental defect in one particular geometrical system. We conclude then that the propositions of pure geometry are analytic. And this is thus to reject Kant's hypothesis that geometry. We conclude then that the propositions of pure geometry are analytic. And this leads us to reject Kant's hypothesis that geometry deals with the form of intuition of our outer sense. For the ground for this hypothesis was that it alone explained how the propositions of geometry could be both true a priori and synthetic. And we have seen that they are not synthetic. Similarly, our view that the propositions of arithmetic are not synthetic but analytic leads us to reject the Kantian hypothesis that arithmetic is concerned with our pure intuition of time, the form of our inner sense. And thus we are able to dismiss Kant's transcendental aesthetic without having to bring forward the epistemological difficulties which it is commonly said to involve. For, for the only argument which can be brought in favor of Kant's theory is that it alone explains certain facts. And now we have found that all, and now we have, and now we have found that the facts which it purports to explain are not facts at all. While it is true that we have a priori knowledge of necessary propositions, it is not true, as Kant proposed, that any of these necessary propositions are synthetic. They are without exception analytic propositions, or, in other words, tautologies. We have already explained how it is that these analytic propositions are necessary and certain. We saw that the reason why they cannot be confuted in experience is that they do not make any assertion about the empirical world. They simply record our determination to use words in a certain fashion. We cannot deny them without infringing the conventions which are presupposed by our very denial, and so falling into self-contradiction. And this is the sole ground of their necessity. As Wittgenstein puts it, our justification for holding that the world could not conceivably disobey the laws of logic is simply that we could not we could not say of an unlogical world how it would look. And just as the validity of an analytic proposition is independent of the nature of the external world, so it is independent of the nature of our minds. It is perfectly conceivable that we should have employed different linguistic conventions from those which we actually do employ. But whatever these crimes, it is perfectly conceivable that we should have employed different linguistic conventions from those which we actually do employ. But whatever these conventions might be, the tautologies in which we recorded them would always be necessary, for any detail of them would be self-stultifying. We see then that there is nothing mysterious about apodeictic certainty of logic and mathematics. Our knowledge that no observation can ever confute the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12 depends simply on the fact that the symbolic expression 5 plus 7 is synonymous with 12. Just as our knowledge that every oculist is an eye doctor depends on the fact that the symbol eye doctor is synonymous with oculist. And the same explanation holds good for every oculist a priori truth. What is mysterious at first sight is that these tautologies should on occasion be so surprising that there would be in mathematics and logic the possibility I want hmm. What is mysterious at first sight is that these tautologies What is mysterious at first sight is that these tautologies should on occasion be so surprising that there should be in mathematical and logic that there should be in mathematics and logic the possibility of invention and discovery. As Poincare says, if all the assertions which mathematics puts forward can be derived from one another by formal logic, mathematics cannot amount to anything more than an immense tautology. Logical inference can teach us nothing essentially new. If everything is to proceed from the principle of identity, everything must be reducible to it. But can we really allow that these theorems, which fill so many books, serve no other purpose than to say in a roundabout fashion, A equals A? Poincare finds this incredible. His own theory is that the sense of invention and discovery in mathematics belongs to it in virtue of mathematical induction, the principle that what is true for the number 1 and true for n plus 1 when it is true for n to the power 11 is true for all numbers. And he claims that this is a synthetic a priori principle. It is in fact a priori, but it is not synthetic. It is a defining principle of the natural numbers, serving to distinguish them from such numbers as the infinite cardinal numbers, to which it cannot be applied. Moreover, we must remember that discoveries can be made not only in arithmetic, but also in geometry and formal logic, where no use is made of mathematical induction. So that even if Poincare were right about mathematical induction, he would not have provided a satisfying explanation of the paradox that a mere body of factory explanation of the paradox and a mere body of so that even if Poincare were right about mathematical induction, he would not have provided a satisfactory explanation of the paradox that a mere body of tautologies can be so interesting and so surprising. The true explanation is very simple. The power of logic and mathematics to surprise us depends, like their usefulness, on the limitations of our reason. A being whose intellect was infinitely powerful would take no interest in logic and mathematics, for he would be able to see at a glance everything that his definitions implied, and accordingly could never learn anything from logical inference, which he was not fully conscious of already. But our intellects are not of this order. It is only a minute proportion. It is only a minute proportion to the consequences of our definitions that we are able to detect at a glance. So even a simple tautology as 91 times 79 is equal to 7,189 is beyond the scope of our immediate apprehension. To assure ourselves that 7,189 is synonymous with 91 times 79, we have to resort to calculation, which is simply a process of tautological transformation, that is, a process by which we change the form of expressions without altering their significance. The multiplication tables are rules for carrying out this process in arithmetic, just as the laws of logic are rules for the tautological transformation of sentences expressed in logical symbolism or in ordinary language. As the process of calculation is carried out more or less mathematically, it is easy for us to make a leap and so unwittingly contradict ourselves, and this accounts for the experience of logical and mathematical falsehoods, which otherwise might appear paradoxical. Clear the risk of error in logical reasoning is proportionate to the length and the complexity of the process of calculation. In the same way, the more complex an analytic proposition is, the more changes its name surprising us. And in the same way, the more complex an analytic proposition is, the more chance it has of interesting and surprising us. It is easy to see that the danger of error in logical reasoning can be minimized by the introduction of symbolic devices, which enable us to express highly complex tautologies in a conveniently simple form. And this gives us an opportunity for the exercise of invention in the pursuit of logical inquiries. For a well-chosen definition will call our attention to analytic truths which would otherwise have escaped us. And the framing of definitions which are useful and faithful may and the framing of definitions which are useful and fruitful may well be regarded as a creative act. However, that's shown that there is no inexplicable paradox involving the view that the truths of logical of logical and mathematics, of logic and goodness. Having thus shown that there is no inexplicable paradox involved in the view that the truths of logic and mathematics are all of them analytic, we may safely adopt it as the only satisfactory explanation of their a priori necessity. And in adopting it, we vindicate the empiricist claim that there can be no a priori knowledge of reality. For we show that the truths of pure reason, the propositions which we know to be valid independently of all experience, are so only in virtue of their lack of factual content. To say that a proposition is true a priori is to say that it is a tautology, and tautologies, though they may serve to guide us in our empirical research for knowledge, do not in themselves contain any academic or and tautologies, though they may serve to guide us in our empirical search for knowledge, do not in themselves contain any information about any matter of fact.